Hello, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I know we'll probably have a couple late arrivals. I just want to, before we get started, sorry about that. I guess somebody was really excited if you guys caught the honking in the background with my sound. But let me get back on my train of thought. Thank you all for joining us, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Cassandra Clevenger, and I work for Trumbull Neighborhood Partnership, and I'm a community resource educator there. And a lot of the work, well, I'll say not a lot of the work I do is around food. I work with the farmers market. I work with a lot of the community gardens in the city of Warren and some of the community garden projects outside of the city. I work with farmers markets throughout the Mahoning Valley in both Trumbull County and Mahoning County. And I also work with folks like Lee Beers, who's one of my co-hosts for tonight over at OSU Extension to help reach folks with resources about farming and about gardening and taking those food growing efforts to their next level, which is part of what we hope to do tonight with, or in the next 8 weeks actually, with these presentations and the series of presentations. So I just want to give a quick shout out to the United States Department of Agriculture that funded this project through the Community Food Projects program and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. That's kind of where I step in. We help, programs with grants, and that's a lot of the work that I do. And we're really excited for the presentation that we have over the next couple weeks. So without further ado, you guys will hear a little bit about me more and my programming over the next few weeks. I'll save some of that for next week, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Lee.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this 8-week course that we have lined up for us. So my name is Lee Beers. I'm the Extension Educator for Agriculture and Natural Resources for Ohio State University Extension right here in Trumbull County. If I have not had the opportunity to meet you, I hope I will in the future. If you have any questions about gardening, pests, diseases, just general gardening or farming needs, I'm right here in Cortland. I can come out and do a site visit, anything you need. So you'll be seeing me throughout the next 8 weeks. You get to listen to me talk for 2 weeks in a row on soils and small fruits. But tonight we have another OSU speaker with us. Tonight is Pam Bennett, and she's going to be talking about successional planting. It's a tough word for me to get out. So you're maximizing the space in your garden. So there's no dead space. And I use the word dead space. There's no dead space. Soil is living. But so that you're maximizing your yield per square foot. Pam is an associate professor, and she is the state coordinator for Master Gardener Volunteers. We do have a Master Gardener program in Trumbull County with about 45 volunteers. So thank you, Pam, for herding cats sometimes with all the volunteers we have throughout the state. And she's also coordinating with the Ohio Department of Agriculture with the Victory Garden seed distribution, which you'll hear more about in the next few weeks coming out of our office here in Trumbull County. And with that, I'll turn it over to Pam. She's a wealth of knowledge. Feel free to ask any questions, use the chat box. You can raise your hand, I believe, on Zoom. Anything you need, just reach out through the chat box and we can try to get all your questions answered. With that, I'll let you take it away, Pam.
All right, Lee. Thanks, Lee and Cassandra. I really appreciate that. And I don't know about you guys, but I've been on Zoom all day, but between the 5:30 end and the 6 o'clock begin to this one, I went outside and I did some pruning on my perennials. I had a great time. Just a half an hour of working outside was so nice. And I just love this weather. I understand it's going to change Thursday, but hey, I'll take what I can get right now because I am really tired of that cold and ice and snow. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Cassandra, for the invitation to be here this evening. I really appreciate it. Love talking about vegetable gardening. And I'm so glad, Lee, you talked about the fact that you're going to share information about the Ohio Victory Garden program, because that's really a cool thing that we're doing with the Department of Agriculture, and we're excited about that. And I'll let you talk about that and not fill up the time for tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about some of the back to the basics, and we're going to talk about beginning vegetable gardeners, beginning producers in terms of succession planting. and some of the tips and some of the tidbits that go along with that. And we're going to ask you to kind of participate in this as well, so that you provide us with some of your ideas, your thoughts, some of the things that you've figured out that help you with that succession planting process. And it is indeed a process. So let me go ahead and go to the next slide here. So producing vegetables is not going to go away, whether it's in your backyard garden or it's in your production garden that you have and you're going to start selling some of the products, or if it's in a community garden that you're involved in. Years ago, when I first started and got into horticulture back in the 70s, vegetable gardens were kind of big, and then they kind of faded away. And then about in 2008, when we hit the kind of recession there, our extension offices received all kinds of requests for assistance in vegetable gardening. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, okay, vegetable gardening is a way to save everything because we can all get started. We can grow our own vegetables. So we saw an increase in vegetable sales. People started growing victory gardens, save money, provide food. Well, the interesting thing about in 2008 is that it hasn't gone away. You know, way back when victory gardens were started in the 20s as part of the war effort, they were started, people used them. They had to have gardens to eat. They had to grow their own food or they didn't have food. Once they were able to get more money, once the war was over, they were then able to go buy food at the grocery store. So they didn't need a vegetable garden anymore. So vegetable gardening just kind of dropped. Then again, there was another surge in another war. And so victory gardens and vegetable gardening has gone up and down. But since 2008, there has been a steady increase in the excitement and the opportunities for gardening. And then, of course, COVID this last year, people have just gone crazy. So gardening has become a huge industry. And our goal right now is to try to keep people excited about gardening. The other thing that really has helped with this is everybody's interested in local foods right now. There's a big movement for local foods. People want healthy eating choices. You know, they want to be able to get that fresh vegetable from their garden as opposed to going to a grocery store and getting one of those tomatoes that you get right now that we're not likely to call tomatoes right now. The environmental factors, you know, the carbon footprint, the shipping from how far they come across the country to get to our grocery shelves. And then, of course, food safety was a huge item back in 2008 when people started thinking about where's my food come from? What kind of products, what kind of chemicals might be used on those? So food safety was another reason for the increase in vegetable gardening. For you and for me, the goal in vegetable gardening is to be successful and to be productive in your efforts. And of course, if you're going to start selling product, to make money. We want to make money. We want to get the most out of it. And you have probably heard this over and over, and you'll hear it again, and you're going to continue hearing it. Vegetable gardens require planning. Just like in this comic, where we plant our perennials up here so that by the end of mud season, they're coming up in our backyard. They're planning ahead. Might not be the best plan, but they're planning. So I would ask you all to put into the chat box, if you would please, how many of you actually have a garden plan? So if everybody would enter into the chat box real quick, yes or no, you have a garden plan, yes, or you don't have a garden plan. Yes or no? Yes, Lorraine. Great, Ron. Yes, no, here to learn, Kirsten. No, Johnny. Kinda, I'm like you. I kind of have it a little bit here and a little bit on paper. Yes, a little, and so forth. You are going to hear this word talked about many times throughout the course of this session, planting that garden. So we all can go out and throw in some tomatoes, throw in some lettuce, and have a successful garden. But when it comes to production, when you want to make a profit off of that, you really have to establish a plan. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight and how you put that plan together, particularly for succession planting. So in terms of, I'm going to go through right now just a few really quick things after I make sure my cell phone is muted so that it doesn't ring. We're going to go through a few things that perhaps you already know. This might be review for some of you. It might be new for some of you. But garden size depends on time, space, the size of your family or the size of your staff that you're working with. You know, if you are working with a group of people and it's a very small group of people and it might just be your family, make sure you know exactly what size you can handle. The recommendation is always to start small, and it's really, really hard when the weather breaks here, in fact, tomorrow, hopefully, if it stays nice, I'm going to plant some lettuce. When it's really nice out and you get in the early spring and you see all the seed catalogs, you go to the garden centers, you go to the garden store, you know, you want to grow and you just start buying and then you start planting. And then all of a sudden you've got way more than you can manage and it becomes a problem or a burden as opposed to being something fruitful or something productive for you. So that plan is going to help you determine, okay, I've got 5 people helping me. How much can we handle and how much can we maintain and manage for the season? Also, your garden location. Everybody should know that plants in the gardens like full sun. The more, the better. The minimum would be 4 to 6 hours. We do know that tomatoes will grow in shade. They will grow in shade, but they won't fruit and they won't produce as much in shade. So the more sun, the better you can meet that plant's needs environmentally, the better that plant's going to grow. So you can see beets and lettuce, those kinds of things, they might be able to take a little bit of shade, but you're going to want, when it comes to tomatoes, peppers, those kinds of things, they want a lot of sun. They're tropical plants. They need a lot of sun. Think about structures, vines, trees, what's around that garden. Are you in a backyard neighborhood area where you have overhead structures, where you have trees, where you might have things that are preventing that full sun from happening? So when it comes to garden location, sometimes we have the luxury of having that wide open backyard space with lots of full sun. But other times we may be growing in a neighborhood where we are in a small urban lot and we want to make the most out of that. So we really have to think about that sun and other structures. Really important, and probably one of the most important things, of course, is that water. What's going to happen when you get into August? August is when everything needs water. Productivity is based on the amount of water. If you look up the amount of water in a tomato or a pepper, it's like 90 to 95%. Don't quote me on that, but it's a lot of water in that. So if you're not giving adequate water to the plant at the time that plant is actually developing that fruit, it's not going to be very useful for you, and it's not going to be very helpful in terms of the amount of moisture that's going to be given to that plant or that fruit. So please make sure you have water source or you're willing to haul water as needed. Other things you want to take into consideration: roads, driveways, structures, varmints. I deal with moles. I deal with groundhogs. I deal with deer. I would love to grow raspberries, but I'm just not going to deal with raspberries because of Japanese beetles. We tend to have high populations. I'm not going to grow sweet corn because I know that if I put sweet corn in, the raccoons are going to take over. And I'm not at the point right now where I want to put up fencing and a structure to prevent that. So think about all these other considerations that go into making sure you have a really good vegetable garden. Kids in the neighborhood, and of course, by all means, underground utility lines. Very important that if you're going to till anything, you're going to grow vegetables, plant trees, or anything, call before you dig, that 1-800 number. And I'm going to put up the next bullet, and I want somebody to put in the chat box why we are concerned about this next bullet. Can anybody tell me why we're concerned about walnut trees? Can anybody tell me why we're concerned about walnut trees? Nobody? Well, there you go, Chrissy Kelly. Thank you. They produce a toxin that won't let plants grow, and they are particularly problematic for tomatoes and anything in that family, Solanaceae family. So they emit a toxin, the walnut toxin called juglone, and that will prevent tomatoes from growing. So if you are in a backyard neighborhood, an urban garden, make sure there are no nearby walnut trees. And it's not just a walnut tree for shade. Remember, those roots go way out, way beyond that drip line. So check around you, look up, make sure if there are any walnut trees, you may want to consider going with a raised bed garden of some sort to be able to grow. Chrissy points out also a walnut mulch. So if you're getting mulch from the township or for somebody who's dropping off the wood chips, you may have an issue with that. Although if it's one walnut tree to 500 other trees, it may not be as concentrated, but it could be an issue as well. So good point, Chrissy. Thank you for bringing that up. Site preparation. In neighborhoods where there's been construction, suburban neighborhoods, unfortunately, isn't this what we get? This is the base that we're dealing with, and we really have to work on creating a good tilth to our soil. So make sure you do your soil test. And if you're into production agriculture, urban garden production is production agriculture, make sure you do a soil test. You want to know what maximum crop production and minimum inputs are. So what is your pH? What nutrients are needed so you get the maximum crop production? Don't work the soil when it's wet. Oh boy, I was out there today looking at it. I was ready to plant, ready to dig, ready to pull weeds, but my soil was still too wet. So if that's the case, you don't want to plant, you don't want to work the soil when it's too wet, or all you're doing is compacting it, making mud clods out of that you could throw in a fight with kids or anything, but you don't want to plant anything in that soil that's compacted. Fall tilling is ideal, although you can spring till. The problem with spring tilling, of course, is right now the soils are wet, so you're going to have to wait. General rule of thumb, add 4 inches of organic matter into 12 inches of soil. That's just a general rule of thumb. Organic matter is always going to help you improve your quality of soil, no matter you have clay soil or you have sandy soil. Either way, organic matter is going to help improve the water holding capacity in sandy soil. It will improve the drainage in clay soil. So think about organic matter. What organic matter do you have access to? What organic matter do you have access to that's inexpensive? Because again, those inputs, you want those, keep those costs to a minimum on those inputs, okay? You are going to hear again about having a plan many times tonight. We're going to talk quite a bit about having a plan. So when it comes to gardening in general, have a plan, but when it comes to succession planning, you really have to think it through. So what we're going to do for the next probably, let's see, 6, 4, 7, about the next 10, 15 minutes, and Cassandra, I'll let you know when to bring people back. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and let's do 29 participants. Let's do 6 breakout rooms of around 4 to 5 people each. And I want you to talk about succession planning. What does succession planning in a vegetable garden mean to you? What is succession planning? So if you would, Cassandra is going to ask you to join a room. You will see a little thing that comes up that says join room 6 or room 5 or whatever. Click on that. It's going to take you into that room. I want everybody to try to turn their screens on if possible, have an open discussion, talk about succession planning and what it means to you. If you are already doing succession planning, fantastic. Share your ideas, your thoughts, what you do to make sure you have that plan going. But I want to kick this whole talk off by having you all kind of get into a room and talk about it. Then we're going to come back and I'm going to ask you to provide me in the chat box, or I'm going to ask you individually to let me know what your group came up with in terms of succession planning, okay? If nobody has questions, Cassandra, let's go ahead and break into 6 breakout rooms. So everybody should see that something has come up that says, please join this breakout room. Click on that and join. So all of you that are not in a room yet, you should click on join on the screen that you see in front of you. So room 1 should be Becky's iPhone. Looks like we have everybody.
the folks that are left, were you guys having a hard time getting in? Do you guys need any assistance? Is there anything I can help with? Just sitting this one out. That's cool too.
Cassandra, is there a way to kind of drop into the breakout rooms as a co-host?
Open the breakout rooms.
Okay.
And then you can join whichever one you'd like.
Okay. I'm not seeing an option to do that.
Did I see Pam did it and I thought she did it herself.
Oh, I got it. Okay, I see. Where the button
Okay,
is.
I was
Right.
hoping because I didn't do it. But once you're in there, you just click on yourself and move yourself to the main session if you want to come back.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. I think you're muted.
Welcome back, everybody. I think everybody's still coming back. 11. Still coming back. I had a chance to kind of jump in and eavesdrop on people, so good conversations. Welcome back as you're coming back in. Looks like we have just about everybody now. 28. Perfect. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for participating. I jumped in and out of several rooms, and some people said they don't know anything about succession planning and are here to learn. Others talked about already starting tomatoes. So we've got a whole wide array of experiences in terms of gardening tonight, gardeners. So we're going to try to cover this and hopefully make it useful for everybody. But we will have time at the end for questions and answers just in case. So going back to having a plan, some of the decisions that you have to make. One of the first decisions, of course, you've got your location, you've got your soil ready, you're all set from the few things I talked about earlier. What's your crop selection? What are you going to grow in terms of, is it for you personally? Is it for you to take to market? And if it's going to market, what sells really well? When you're going to a farmer's market, you've got to ask what's easy to transport, what's easy to sell, what's easy to package, and what has good shelf life. It's very difficult sometimes to take lettuce and then save it for 2 or 3 days. You've got to sell that as soon as you possibly can. So the preferences and what you want to sell is something you have to decide. And then also your size of staff. And I say staff, you may not have staff, but if you're into production, vegetable production, you might have a few people helping, or it could just be, in reality, it could just be your family. So you may be working with your family and who's going to help do that weeding and, what varieties do they like and so forth. And then we have choices to make between what exact species and what are we going to grow in those species. We have hybrid plants. We have open pollinated plants. We have heirloom plants. You have seed companies. You have all different options in terms of where you're going to buy your plants and what types of plants you're going to buy. So the next step in this planning process is to decide what I'm going to grow and where I'm going to buy it and what varieties that I'm going to use. And of course, the seed catalogs are going to be really helpful. Evaluations and trials are going to be very helpful. And sometimes it's just trial and error. You find something that you really like and you're going to stick with that every year. But if that's the case, just make sure that you write it down. So for me, planning is this 3-ring binder that I have page holders inside or page protectors inside, and all my seed packets I stick inside there. So the next year when I go back and say, okay, what did I order from Johnny's Seeds? I've got the exact variety, the exact company I ordered from. Everything is in that 3-ring binder. It's not neat. It's kind of messy, but it works for me. And I keep it out in the garage with all my other gardening stuff. So I have all my information just stuffed in there. Plant tags go in there as well. So anything that I use for this gardening season, I drop down in those page holders, keeps everything organized for me. Now, when it comes to planting and some of the decisions you've got to make, we got to think about right now. I heard people in some of these rooms talk about, well, I've already planted lettuce. I told you I'm going to plant lettuce tomorrow. Can you plant tomatoes this week? Absolutely not. I'm part of a Facebook group called Garden Center Professionals, and they're already talking about people going into the garden centers and saying, hey, you got any tomato plants? You got any pepper plants? And when we're in the garden center business, we want to look at people like, are you nuts? It's only March. Why would we plant tomatoes in March? Obviously, it's not the time to plant tomatoes. It's not the time to plant peppers in the garden, but the weather makes it just so conducive to people wanting to get out and wanting to plant. So we've got to educate people about cool season and warm season crops. And tomatoes, of course, are one of those warm season crops. So on this slide, you see a list of cool season plants that are not injured by frost. And then you see a list of cool season plants that are injured by frost, but don't take temperatures above 70. So all of these cool season plants grow better in the early spring, March, April, May, when the temperatures are cool. Once you get into June and you start getting hot temperatures, things like mustard and lettuce and spinach, they all start to bolt or go into their flowering phase. And we don't want that because they start to taste bitter, they don't taste good, and then of course they flower. Now personally, I let some of them go ahead and flower because they reseed and come back the next year. So my mustard, for instance, I always let it go to flower, it reseeds, and it comes back even in the fall and the next season. So some things are okay, but for the most part, you lose that quality of flavor when they bolt. So things like asparagus, Brussels sprouts, all of those will tolerate cool season temperatures, and they're not going to be injured by frost. Cool season, but injured by frost are all those on the right. And I will tell you, several years ago, the traditional time to plant potato is St. Patrick's Day, March 17th. I planted on March 15th several years ago, and we had 3 frosts and hard freezes after that. I lost the top of those potatoes every single time. Fortunately, they had enough starch, enough sugars in the root, in the tuber, that they continued to grow and sent out new growth, but they will not tolerate a hard frost. So you've kind of got to watch your temperatures. I am going to go ahead and plant lettuce tomorrow. I'm going to plant spinach. I'll probably plant peas, radishes, but I'm going to hold off on planting my potatoes until at least mid-March, probably next week, I'll probably put potatoes in. So think of those cool season crops versus our warm season crops. Now, warm season crops are those tropical plants that you would find growing naturally, natively in South America and Africa. They like tropical climates. They do not, absolutely do not tolerate cool soils. I was on a call earlier this morning and someone in the, I believe it was Lake County area, said that their soil temperature was 46. That is way, way, way too cold for any of these warm season crops. So if you plant tomatoes right now, guaranteed they're not going to make it. Typically, we think about mid-May or around there, and after farther, later on up north where you guys are, maybe a week after what we are here. I'm in Ohio. I'm in Central Ohio, Springfield area, Clark County, between Dayton and Columbus. I can plant these things about mid-May. You might wait a week later, but it's the warm soils. If you plant them in early May and we get that cold, wet, damp May with rain and so forth, these plants are just going to rot. They're not going to survive. Same thing with our squashes, our cucumbers. All of these that you see listed here are warm season plants. That doesn't mean you can't start them right now. One of the groups I joined in on, somebody said they're already starting tomatoes. Starting tomatoes is fine indoors. Starting peppers, all of these plants can be started indoors early and then put outside in mid-May. They will absolutely not tolerate a frost and whatsoever will not tolerate cold soils. So in terms of succession planting, here's some information that we're going to talk about here for the next half hour or so. So there's different ways we can do this, but the idea is to fill in those bare spots, so to speak, and nothing bothers me more than a little bit of a bare spot in the garden. I want to fill every single spot, but it's a continuous harvest. So if you're taking plants to market, or if you're a homeowner and let's say you want to can, or you want to grow something and you want it to come on periodically and not all at once, succession planting is what you want to look at. So we're going to talk about warm season followed by cool season, second crop of the same plant every 2 weeks, same species, and different cultivars with a variety of maturing dates. The biggest thing you have to think about here is if you're planting something in late July, August, and September, you've got to think about watering. Because if you plant something the 1st of August and you don't get any moisture, those seeds are not going to germinate. And when they germinate, if it stays dry, that's like the most important time for seedlings to get watered. So you've got to think about that watering. And above all, have I mentioned this word, planning? It really and truly takes a lot of planning for succession planting. You've got to think about this and you've got to write it down. And I'm going to talk about these steps and some examples and some things that you can do to plan for succession planning. So let's start with cool season crop, followed by warm, followed by cool. So in this case, we're going to plant something in the next couple weeks. We're going to harvest it about 1st, 2nd, 3rd, maybe the 4th week in May, sometime in mid to late May. Then we're going to plant something that's a warm season crop, early, maybe mid-June even. Let that grow all summer. Harvest that by, say, like 1st of August, 2nd week in August, and plant something, again, that's a cool season crop that's going to grow and thrive into the cooler temperatures of fall. So here's some examples you can see on the slide. Garlic. I planted my garlic. Garlic always should be, doesn't have to be, should be planted in the fall. My garlic is just now starting to grow. I'm going to harvest that sometime around the 1st week of June. After I harvest that, I can go in and plant squash or cucumbers or something that's going to grow the rest of the summer and harvest that crop. And then when I harvest that crop, dig that out and put in oats and clover, for instance, here as a cover crop. So last year I started with broccoli. I harvested the broccoli early in the summer. I then planted summer squash. And then in early September, mid-September, I think September 15th, I planted red clover and oats, and that was my cover crop. This spring, I'm going to till that under as a cover crop, and I'll start that process again. So you can see some examples here: lettuce early, green beans, then broccoli, cucumber, green bean, then spinach. All these different methods of starting with one crop. When it's harvested, you plant another one, and then you plant another one after that. Now, how do you know how to do this? Well, you look at the maturity dates on your seed label or your seed packet or in the catalog. The maturity date is when that plant should be harvested. So let's say I am planting garlic in the fall. I know it's going to be harvested in June. I've got a cucumber that's a 63-day. So mid-June, mid-July, mid-August, I can harvest that cucumber, and then I can plant something in the fall that goes into September and even October. And if I'm really smart, I use season extension and I go into November and December. And one of the guys was talking about, he just harvested recently some of his last fall crops from last year because he had season extension. So in this case, you're planting a cool crop followed by a warm crop, followed by a cool crop. So we look at spring, summer, spring, and then look at those short season crops and which ones then would work for us. Another option, second crop of the same species. So you find something that you really like, and it's a great, you really like it. Green beans followed by green beans, squash followed by squash, a short summer season crop. So green beans, if they're 50 days, you could plant those mid-June or mid-May, harvest them, and then plant them again. So it's the same species, but you still have time. And again, you look at the number of days to maturity, and you look at, okay, if I plant this in mid-August, am I going to have 49 to 50 days before we get a hard frost? So you look at that length of time. So second crop of the same species. So you're just following one crop with the other crop. Now, this is for somebody who perhaps is going to market. In fact, this is critical. Many of my farmers market growers, they focus on this regularly. Every 2 weeks, you plant the same species. So for instance, if I plant green beans in mid-May, and I plant all of my green beans in mid-May, I'm going to harvest all of them the 1st of July. That means I've got a bunch of green beans that I've got to take to market, or I've got to can, or I've got to do something with in order to use those green beans that all come ready at once. However, if I stagger it out, so I plant maybe 3 rows on May 15th, 3 more rows on May 29th, 3 more rows on June 12th, and 3 more rows on June 26th, now I'm staggering my harvest dates. So now I can provide green beans all summer from July to the middle of August, all summer long, giving me time to either take them all to market, so I always have something to sell, or I have time to can them when they all come on at the same time. Another one, cultivars with different maturation dates. So I've talked about the days to maturity. Every seed catalog, every label that you will see will tell you those particular days to maturity. So in edamame is one of my favorite crops, edible soybeans. I love these. Now that's if I can keep them from the rabbits, because the rabbits tend to get to them before I can. So I've got my methods this year. I'm going to fence them as soon as I plant them, because they love these things. So the first year I grew edamames, I grew one that I think was 109 days. And I planted tons of rows. I had like 10 rows of them. Not long, I don't have long rows, but 10 rows of them. With edamames, they all come ready at one time. Think about soybeans. Think about when farmers harvest soybeans. They're all ready to go at the same time. So all of a sudden, I had all of these edamames ready to go, ready to pick, ready to harvest, and I had to do something with them. So I can remember my husband and I, we picked as many as we could. We steamed as many as we could, and we froze as many as we could, but we certainly couldn't do all of them. So because it's such a long season crop, it didn't make sense to go with the previous method of planting every 2 weeks. It would be really hard to do that. So in this case, I started then looking at those different cultivars and found the ones that I liked and planted them at the same time, but you notice they have different maturity dates. So agate is 65 days. In fact, I just put an order in for agate today. So 65 days from planting, I'm going to harvest that row. Then I'm going to plant, I can't plant envy right now because everybody I went to had envy was out, sold out. Seeds are kind of a little premium right now. So then I ordered Kirikachi and I ordered Midori Giant. Now I know that's not a whole big difference in planting, but I might delay the planting on one So again, going back to, remember I said you got to plan. I have to really think about this. When do I want these to come on that I have the time and the capacity to either A, I'm going to sell them at market, or in my case, I actually freeze them. So different cultivars have different maturation dates. And when I say cultivar, it's just a cultivated variety of a really good plant. So all of these that you see, these all have different characteristics, but they're all edamame. Okay. And again, we'll answer any questions that we have that you might have at the end of this. So the recommendation, and if you're not sure, you can find all kinds of charts all over in terms of when do you start. The first thing you look at is maturity date. But this chart that I'm going to show you is a general recommendation of when you want to start these fall crops. So August 1st, you can start all of these bush beans, beets, broccoli, etc. about the 1st of August. Now, one of the things that I like to do, I like to try to find plants when it comes to like broccoli and cauliflower, but you are not going to find plants. Tell me if you have ever found broccoli plants in a garden center in August. And I will tell you, at least in the Clark County area, I have never, ever seen a garden center carry broccoli plants. So I actually start my own plants early in order to have those plants to put in the garden on the 1st of August. Or you can actually direct seed if you want to as well. Then around the 1st to the 15th of August, you can put in kale, kohlrabi, and radishes. And again, these are based on their maturity dates. And then spinach, you can go clear up till September 1st because spinach, turnips, collards, and lettuce, they have a very short maturation date. So you can do all of that anytime during the month of first part of September. And again, this all depends on that frost date. Remember, some of these are killed by a frost. Some of these aren't damaged by frost. And if you add that season extension, that grow cover, that little greenhouse that you put on, you could extend that season a little bit longer. So you kind of have to play with, what you're planning on doing for the fall, back it up on the timing to that maturation date, and then plant accordingly. But if you're going to plant bush beans the 1st of August, and we hit that dry August, you've got to make sure you water and take care of those seedlings. And I think that's probably one of the areas that many people struggle with in August is making sure those new seedlings are getting watered along with the other plants. All right, let's talk a little bit about how you can take advantage of plant spacing to maximize your crop production. So traditional row planting is what we typically see. You've got one row, you've got 15 inches between that, you've got another row, and then you've got space between each plant. So that's kind of our traditional way of planting our gardens. We also have hill planting, and hill planting is basically for our cucurbits, cucumbers, squash, melons. We mound that soil up because that mound of soil gets warmer sooner than just the ground, the soil level, the ground level. And you can plant your seeds and you get quicker germination with your squash and any of your cucurbits and anything in that family. Think about bush varieties. There are a lot of cultivars that are on the market right now that are for gardeners who are in apartment houses, for instance. They grow in containers, or gardeners who have very small backyard gardens. Well, these varieties tend to produce just as much as the regular species. So if you're looking at a bush variety, you might have less space, but you're going to get good production. So look at those cultivars that are called, bush. There's bush cucumbers, bush watermelons. There's all those different types of cultivars that are classified as short, compact, still produce a lot, but are not going to give you as much trouble in terms of space. All right, another thing, plant spacing. So many of you may remember years ago, square foot gardening was like a big deal. You had this 12 or 4 by 4 foot area, and in each area you had a 1 foot area for each particular plant. Well, think about that. Think about how big a tomato plant gets. Think about how big peppers get. Some of our disease issues are encouraged because we don't have good air spacing. So square foot gardening, concentrated planting is not something I would recommend, particularly if you're going to produce vegetables for sale. If you're going to do a farmer's market or you want to produce them for sale. Even for a homeowner, you start putting 4 tomatoes in this little 4x4 foot pot, you have no air circulation. And hopefully at some point in time during this 8-week session, you're going to talk about diseases and some of the pest management strategies. And one thing for, helping to mitigate some of those disease problems is spreading things out and getting good air circulation. So intensive planting can be a real challenge when it comes to some of the disease and other pest problems. And again, as I mentioned, there are space-saving varieties available. And then typical planting is our wide rows, having that 3-foot row, and people like to take their tiller down and, use that mantis to go down and kind of cultivate. However, as I mentioned earlier, I don't like to see any space wasted in the garden. I try to make sure I get as much out of an area as I possibly can. So I use intercropping quite a bit. And this is not intercropping for pest control, because there's not a lot of research that shows that planting carrots around tomatoes kills insects. It doesn't. So I use intercropping though for space saving methods. So for instance, in the bottom left picture, I will plant my lettuce. And then if lettuce is supposed to be 12 inches apart, right in between that row, I will plant onions. And my lettuce, typically I harvest, again, remember lettuce bolts when it gets hot. So I typically harvest all of my lettuce prior to pulling the onions. So I can take out my lettuce, it's done. The onions then can continue to grow. I'll pull out some of the onions and have them in my salads with my lettuce, but I'll let them grow because they're the big bulb type onions. And I like to see them get to a size where they're, growing so I can get them and not can them, but either chop them up for freezing, use them in salsa, or I actually store some of them on the storing varieties like the Dutch onions. So I will do intercropping with lettuce. You can put cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, large plants with radishes in between, because radishes are a very short season plant. So you can put your broccoli in. As that grows, you're harvesting your radishes and you're saving space. Leaf lettuce and endive. All of these can be used for intercropping. Now, when you're getting ready to do something like this, again, you've got to think about it. You've got to put a plan in place. You want to make sure that plants are not going to get shaded. So I'm not going to plant something that is going to get shaded in between my broccoli. Like I plant 36 broccoli plants. I'm not going to put my bush beans in between there, because those broccoli plants are going to cover those bush beans and shade that and not give me the good production. But something early season like lettuce, like endive, like onions, those kinds of things, I can easily put together side by side with intercropping. And you'll see a lot of examples with this at some of the demonstration gardens that I've seen. This particular one has broccoli and beets side by side. So the idea here is broccoli would be harvested in the top left, and then the beets would come on. And then in the bottom right, this was a research plot on campus that had cabbage. And then it also, as you can see, it had carrots and onions. So they were able to harvest the carrots early because they wanted small carrots, let the onions grow, let the cabbage grow, pull out the onions, and then let the cabbage continue. So it's really easy to do. You just have to really think about it. And again, I've mentioned the word planning several times. That's something we absolutely have to do in order to think about, okay, write this down. I've got to plant this August 1st so that you know what you're going to do at what time during the season. Okay. So one of the things I will caution you about in terms of when you're doing succession planting, when you're doing intercropping, and all of these different methods I've talked about, you may or may not have heard, and hopefully if you haven't, you'll learn about rotation. We use crop rotation commonly. You've heard about it probably in soybean fields and corn fields. We use that to help minimize pest problems. If I keep tomato plants in the same spot year after year after year, I'm building up any potential pest problems on that particular tomato plant. For instance, I planted potatoes many years ago, and all of a sudden I harvested in that summer and I had wireworms. One of the best ways to eliminate wireworms was to take those potatoes and move them to another area of the garden that's pretty good distance away from the area I had them in, and starve those wireworms. So if I'd have planted potatoes right back in that spot where I pulled them out, I'm just feeding those wireworms, and that population is just growing and doing great. But if I remove that crop through rotation, put it in another part of the garden, starve those wireworms that are in that soil, I'm likely to help prevent or minimize pest problems. So we rotate to really help us with pest problems. So looking at some of the charts when you're thinking about rotating, so mustard family, nightshade family, goosefoot, you want to rotate out of that family. So in the mustard family, we have radishes and turnips. In the nightshade family, remember I mentioned Solanaceae family, we have tomatoes and peppers. In the goosefoot family, we have beets and chards. And again, think about the seeds of beets and chard are very much alike. Seeds of mustard, radishes, turnips are much alike. So we're switching out these families. So if I keep planting mustard, radish, if I keep planting that same family in the same spot every single year, I'm increasing potential for pest problems. And in terms of radishes and turnips, wireworms are a pest. They're just a little tiny worm that, you pull the carrot, you're ready to eat it. It's got these, tunnels all through there. That's not something we want to have at the time of harvest. So keep in mind, if you're going to use any of these succession plantings, you want to make sure that you rotate those families. A final question you have to think about is seeds or plants. And this depends on what you want to do. Are you more comfortable with planting things indoors? You're starting your crops indoors, like tomatoes indoors, cabbage, broccoli, or are you working with a grower, or you're going to go to the garden center to purchase the starts already and then put them into the garden? It's really funny. When I started my career back in the 70s, you would never have seen lettuce or corn in a flat as a start. You would direct seed that. Now you see everything. I've seen lettuce, I've seen corn, I've seen cucumbers, watermelons, anything to help the consumer get ahead of the game, I guess. But it's up to you to determine. You've got to decide, okay, do I want to buy my plants from somebody and put those in the ground as starts, or do I want to start them myself, or can I direct seed? So you kind of have to make that decision when you get ready to plant, what you're going to use. So as I mentioned, there are lots of decisions for you to make as a producer. We want to put things on paper. We want to know, okay, last year in my garden, I had tomatoes in this quadrant, I had peppers in this quadrant, I had cabbage over here, and I had beans over here. If I'm going to start rotating, where do things go? How do I spread things out so that I'm rotating as much as possible? What varieties do I have? How many rows? And then keeping good records. If you are indeed going to go to market, you want to make sure you keep good records. Last year, I planted this variety of tomato and everybody loved it. I'm going to stick with this variety. Record keeping is truly important, not just for the home gardener, backyard gardener, but for the producer as well. So there's lots of decisions to make. There's lots of planning that goes into this, but it can be done. It's a lot of fun, sit down in the winter months. What else do you have to do? January, February, March, when you're thinking about this, put this stuff on paper, figure out a way that you can keep track of it as much as you possibly can, implement that tracking, and then get ready to start your garden and become successful. And of course, we're always going to have pest problems. So, your good old scarecrow will take care of those pest problems, hopefully. But in reality, you've got to be ahead of the game on those as well. And I'm sure part of your training on these next 8 weeks will have to do with some of the pest problems that we see in vegetable gardens. So with that, Cassandra and Lee, I'm going to go back and open it up to questions on succession planting, or just general questions about vegetable gardens. I'd be glad to help.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, so if you have any questions on, I hate this word, successional planting, sorry. We'd be happy to talk about that. If you want to use the chat box and put in some questions. In one of the breakout rooms I jumped into, we grow a lot of pumpkins and gourds. So if there's a time of year that you are planning for a market, pumpkins is probably the best example for that. You don't want pumpkins in August. You're not going to sell them. pumpkins the first week of October is a different story. So if you look at the days of maturity and work backwards, you can sort of get your plan for when you're going to harvest, because days of maturity go from 75 to 100, 120 days. So planning that out works really well. And I know Pam also mentioned the edamame.
Mm.
Not a huge fan of edamame. I do like it on occasion, but I use that same method for sweet corn, because if you plant all of your sweet corn at once, you have all of your ears of corn in one basket. So if you can spread that out with different varieties and different maturities, you can expand your market a little bit too. So.
Right. And in a market situation, Lee, you want to have something on a regular basis. If you look at sweet corn fields, you'll see different sizes. And that's because they're thinking about, okay, this batch is going to be for the 1st of August. This batch is for middle August. You know, they plant at a variety of different times in order to meet that market need. Yeah. And I look at it from a backyard gardener perspective. Okay, I don't have time to harvest all my edamame in September. There's just so much going on, and there's too much. So that's why I started spacing them out so that I could harvest them, you know, every 2 weeks. I was getting something that I could take care of, I could freeze, I could actually handle. So it is equal to backyard gardeners and producers in terms of, you know, what you're going to do with it.
I did make one note when you mentioned bush varieties. I'm a huge fan of bush varieties just for the weed control aspect. I am not trying to weed in between vines that are going rogue. It does make your time a little bit more effective there, and just in weeding with some of the bush varieties for cucumbers. So if you have questions, don't be shy. You can unmute yourself, use the chat box. We're here to answer questions. Want to make sure everybody is getting the information they need for your own personal operation or garden.
Cassandra, if there aren't any questions, did you want to open the Miro board to kind of do some brainstorming for the rest of this series?
You're muted, Cassandra.
I am muted. Thank you.
There was a question. Are there any PDFs you recommend to follow for successional planting?
So Lee and I were talking earlier, Cindy. There's not a whole lot of information available in doing a search in terms of how to do this or what to do. So succession planting seems to be like part of the big vegetable garden picture. So there's really nothing. I would recommend anytime anybody does a search is, if let's say you want, I'm going to put it in the chat box, succession, S-U-C-C, how you spell it? Lee, you can't say it, I can't spell it.
S-U-C-C-E-S-S-I-O-N-A-L. How many degrees does it take to pronounce and spell successional?
Yeah, really. All right. So I just put this in here. So doing a search, succession planting in vegetable gardens, space, site, :edu. And Lee and I are big proponents of this simply because, you know, we work for the university. We focus on research-based information. If you want really good information on anything in terms of gardening, always use that site:edu extension. That will take you to the university information. Maryland has a good site. Cornell has a good site on vegetables. So there are several universities that have really good information on vegetables, and succession planting is part of that big package of information. So it was a good question.
I think Kirsten asked the same question. Madison asked, I recently moved into a new house with some land and have onions absolutely everywhere, including in the flower beds, gravel. If I just ignore them, will they continue to return? And
ooh, not only will they return, but they will continue to grow strong. So they're probably wild onions. And the problem with controlling wild onions is that they have this really nice, shiny kind of like sheath that protects them from any kind of herbicides. So if you are going to use a herbicide, and they can be controlled by herbicides such as glyphosate, I'll do a caveat on that in a second, you need to break them up so that that sheath, that nice shiny sheath over them is broken so that it will absorb the herbicide. So what I usually do is kind of take a hard nose rake and go back and forth across the soil where they are. And I will spray then the foliage. Now, glyphosate is one of those products that kills everything. So if that's in a bare perennial bed or a vegetable garden that doesn't have anything in it, I can use it in there. But if it's in the lawn, I can't use it without killing all the grass. And there are other weed control products that will work on onions, but the problem is it just slides right off that nice shiny sheath. So you really need to break that up first. The other option, of course, is hand digging. And I've gotten to the point now in my perennial beds and vegetable garden that I will find clumps of them growing here and there. So I always go in when the soil's moist, not when it's wet, not when it's dry. I go in, it was just moist, that I can stick a soil knife in there, kind of pop them up, make sure I get every single little bulblet, every tiny bulb. I mean, if you leave anything, it's going to continue to grow. So the key is to try to knock down as many as you can. So don't go in and till a garden that has onions everywhere, or you'll just spread them. So, try to knock them down as much as you can, and you can use herbicides on them, but you got to follow the labels. You got to break that shiny sheath and hand digging. So it's a multiple pronged operation to get it done.
Yeah, and I'll add that if you are using black plastic and you have an opportunity to put that down in the fall for your row covers, excluding sunlight and warming up the soil, those are two things wild onions do not care for. And as they'll come out of the ground with those bulbs, they're going to expend those resources, and your onion problem will be a lot less the following year.
Yep.
My problem is dandelions. It's a constant battle.
So
Lorraine, I think that's you and every homeowner in the United States.
So here again, Lorraine, the thing you have to think about, that dandelion, that thistle, they all have really thick tap roots. And any piece of that taproot that's left in the soil regrows. And if you don't get the whole thing, it's going to regrow. So a lot of mistakes that people make is, they've heard, oh, vinegar works. If I pour vinegar on it, it's going to kill it. Vinegar will kill a plant. It's a high salt content. It will kill the plant, but it only top kills it. So you're only killing that foliage. You're not killing the root. So the problem with anything like that, like thistles, even your wild onions, anything like that, they have a thick taproot. That's the storage organ. That's sugars. And those sugars provide regrowth for that plant. So if you don't get everything off of that plant, you're not going to kill that dandelion. Consequently, people think they can spray a dandelion or dig it out one time and it's going to be gone. It's going to take multiple times, either spraying several times until you deplete that storage organ, or making sure if you're going to dig them out, you dig and get every single thing. Eventually, you can dig a dandelion or a thistle and just keep digging it and eventually starve it to death. So as it grows, you dig it. As it grows, you dig it or you kill it. That storage organ, the bigger that is, the harder it is to get rid of it. So dandelions are really tough to control because of that storage root.
Thanks, Pam. Next question. You mentioned planting oats, clover as a cover crop. What do you do with them? Just turn them over in the spring. When you do harvest, when do you harvest / remove them?
So on my cover crop, first time I've tried them, Ann Shannon, Lorain County did a program last year. So I got inspired to do cover crops. So I bought a mixture of oats and clover, red clover. I am going, as soon as it starts to grow, mine, I was looking at them today, they really haven't grown. As soon as it really starts to grow and put on some size, I'm going to hit them with glyphosate, knock them down, and turn them under. The red clover in particular, because I really don't want it to take hold in the soil. So I'm just going to turn it under after I knock it out with Roundup, and then add that as my cover or my organic matter to that soil. First time I've grown them, and I'm kind of excited about doing it because I've not had the space available in my garden to actually get a cover crop in, after I harvest. You want to try to get a cover crop in early September, and sometimes I have stuff still growing. So that's my plan on my cover crop here, but it's just now starting to green up, but it certainly is not looking like it's ready to turn yet.
And on that, you can get some cover crops that are winter killed. So you can put them in the fall and then Mother Nature takes care of it for you. So turnips are one, but I will caution you against turnips if you are not a fan of rotten animal smell, because they will rot and be very unpleasant for you and your neighbors.
Yep, good point. Yeah, I've never really grown cover crops, and I think the biggest challenge for home gardeners, if you don't have a large enough garden, it's really hard to have everything harvested and out by the time you need to plant your cover crops to get them to grow. Because the later you plant them, the less opportunity for you to get them up and growing. So early to mid-September, I think I planted mine around mid-September. I had enough time for it to grow and establish before we got a hard freeze. So even if you have a small area, I would suggest, like, if you've pulled everything out and you've got a small area, I'd suggest throwing some seed down and trying cover crops, because they really are excellent for adding that organic matter.
Right. And Becky asked, how do I get my soil tested?
Well, Lee, I'll let you answer that up in your area.
Okay. Well, Becky, that is a great question. If you want to get your soil tested, we sell the kits in our office in Cortland. So if you give us a call Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30, we can either put one in the mail for you, or you can stop into our office on Mondays and Thursdays between 8:30 and 4:30 and pick one up. You can actually order them online at trumbull.osu.edu. And again, we'll put them into the mail. So we sell you the kits, and what that is, it's a little envelope with instructions on how to take your soil sample. You dry it out, you put it in a little baggie, you mail it off to Penn State. About a week and a half to 2 weeks, you get your results back. And at the same time you get your results back, I get a copy here in the office. So if you have any questions, you can give me a call. We can work through it together to find out what you need for your garden.
I would agree, Lee. We use Penn State, and their lab does a great job and gives you a really good report feedback on what to do. I would agree with that.
And a lot of people ask, why don't we use Ohio State lab? It's because we don't have a soil testing lab or facility anymore.
Yep.
All right. Other questions. Can you plant vegetables in an area that has been hit with Roundup or similar?
This is a really great question. So Roundup, which is glyphosate, is a product that once it hits the soil, it's bound up in our clay, or it's used by the plant. So Roundup label will usually tell you within 7 to 10 days of spraying, you can go ahead and plant. It breaks down quickly. Roundup does not hang around for a long time. So you could put vegetables in an area that has been hit with Roundup. Now, when you say similar, it has to be glyphosate. There are other products that maybe have glyphosate and other things mixed in it. There are products like 2,4-D, which is a 2,4-D, and it has other products for a weed control. That is not something that you're going to want to put in the vegetable garden. So you need to read the label. The label on Roundup or glyphosate will tell you, and Roundup is just the brand name. That glyphosate label will tell you when you can plant following that spray. So always, always, always read the label.
Okay. Any general considerations with raised bed gardens?
So the biggest thing with raised bed is to make sure you have the right soil. Sometimes a lot of people will put in regular vegetable garden soil, and that's fine, that works. But the idea with raised bed gardens is that you dry out faster in the spring. I mean, I've got 2 raised bed gardens that I'm going to put my lettuce in tomorrow. I would never be able to plant lettuce in the ground right now because it's still really wet, but my raised beds are dry. They're above ground, they're raised, they dry out faster, they warm up faster. So make sure you use the proper soil in there. Now, some people will use a soilless mix, which is, the bag stuff you buy at the garden centers, large bags of soilless mix that doesn't have soil in it. So keep in mind, if you use a soilless mix, you really have to make sure you fertilize. If you use garden soil, which is a mixture of sand, silt, and clay holds on to that nutrient and will allow those plants to have some nutrients, but you're still going to have to fertilize, so you should always do that soil test. General considerations in terms of drainage, you should make sure it has good drainage, and if you use a soilless mix, you're going to have good drainage. Because you've got a little bit higher raised bed, you may have better drainage than what you have in the ground. But really and truly, raised beds give you that advantage of starting earlier in the season than the garden itself, anything that's in the ground. And like I said, my raised beds, I went out and checked them today. They're nice and dry at the top layer. I can go in and plant. My garden beds are still quite wet.
Great, thanks, Pam. Becky, sorry, how long did it say to take the soil test results back? This time of year, 1 to 2 weeks by the time they get their results, or sorry, from the time you send the soil in, it's usually about 1.5 to 2 weeks until you get it back. As we get into the height of the gardening season, so mid-April through the entire month of May, the soil test lab is running as fast as they possibly can. So you may see 2 to 3 week return time, and that's perfectly okay. Most of the fertilizer you're going to put down, you don't have to have incorporated before you plant. You know, you can amend your soil as you are going through the gardening season. So you still have time. And we still have a bit of frost in the county here in the ground. So you may not even be able to get out and get your soil samples yet. Wait a couple of weeks until it warms up. You still have plenty of time. And
You guys are up there in the far north, right, Lee?
yeah, it's not Ashtabula County with the snow, but it's still cold enough.
Yep.
Jen, if we are in Mahoning County, can we still contact you for soil tests, or should we call the Canfield office? You can absolutely contact us. You can also contact the Mahoning County office. So Mahoning County still has the Penn State soil test. How you would pick those up, and I believe they are a little bit more expensive because they'll actually mail them in for you. So you would have to contact the Mahoning County office for their soil test prices. Ours are $14 for one kit, but if you get 3 or more, they're $12 a piece. But it doesn't matter if you're Mahoning County. If you want one, we'll put one in the mail to you. And Lorraine had a comment, raised beds need watered more often as well.
Good point, Lorraine. Absolutely. And it depends on how high. I mean, my beds are like 3 foot tall, so they definitely need more. If you're just using like a landscape timber, maybe not as much. So you're right. It does depend on how high those raised beds are and how much more water you might need.
Yeah. And as we get into our small fruits, it takes about 400 gallons of water to produce 1 quart of blueberries. So keep that in mind too when you're planting your garden. Make sure you have access to water.
Yeah, I think, Lee, going back, you know, if y'all start thinking about let's look up the amount of water that is in a tomato or a pepper. And when you look at that percentage and compare that to how much water you're providing in August when they're developing those fruits, you can see why you get those really thin walled peppers. You know, we're looking for those really thick, juicy peppers that have nice thick walls. Providing that consistent watering is just so important. I think sometimes we forget about that in August because we think, oh, you know, scattered rain showers, maybe at least I do. Maybe I'll get the rain today and it doesn't come. And then, okay, tomorrow it says scattered showers in the afternoon. Maybe I'll get it and you don't. And then, of course, it always happens that when I do water the garden, we get a scattered rain shower. But taking that chance, you're not going to get that best production.
Catherine asked, is it beneficial to put lime on the soil? And if it is, what time of the season?
Oh, wow. Catherine, this is where a soil test is really important. And there are probably only a few places in Ohio that would need to lime their soil. I remember my grandparents and my dad, even years ago, that was kind of a thing to do. Everybody limed their soil in the fall, especially their vegetable gardens or their lawns. The only reason you might need lime is if you have a severely low, extremely low pH and you need to bring that pH up. My pH in Clark County is 7 to 7.4. If I added lime, I would go from okay to much worse. Down around Hocking County, that area, they have a good maybe 5, 6.5. So they really don't need much lime. Farmers add lime because they're removing a lot of nutrients from the soil. They're doing things that we might not be doing in the vegetable garden that requires them to add lime. But farmers also soil test on a regular basis. And again, going back to those inputs, they want to minimize inputs because lime costs money, nutrients cost money, and maximize those outputs. So that soil test is going to tell you if you need lime or not. Lee, I'll let you answer the pH in your area because I'm not familiar with Mahoning and your soil pH.
Yeah, so we are not as fortunate as you are over there in the west side of the state of Ohio. We're on the
Really?
other side of the karst escarpment. So our subsoils are 5.5.
Really?
Yeah, liming is beneficial if it's needed. So
Wow.
we get our soil tests in our office, and I would say 90 to 95% of the soil test kits that come in from home gardeners or backyard gardeners are above a pH of 7. I've seen them as high as 8.8,
Ooh,
and that
wow.
is just as bad as too low of acidity for our garden. So only apply lime if you need it. And the only way to know if you need it is through a soil test. We are going to be talking about soil testing later in this series, and soil fertility and all of that. I can't
Good.
remember the date off the top of my head, but it is coming up in a couple of weeks. We're going to get into that in much more detail, but only apply lime if your soil needs it. And if you have a wood stove, this is where I think a lot of our gardeners run afoul. Wood ashes are just like lime. So if you're putting wood ashes as an organic matter or a fertilizer component to your soil, you're actually probably doing more harm than good. If you have a pH that is too high, you are no longer in the realm of needing to apply lime. You're probably in the realm of needing to apply sulfur to drop your pH. So always do a soil test. Again, we're going to talk about this
Good.
at length later in the series, but yes, always soil test. Lime may be beneficial. Many times it's not.
April
Yep.
6th is our soil test, our soil and soil amendments workshop. You all are registered for that. So just as you registered for the whole series. So
Great.
just a quick shout out to that. I had a question in regards to thinking about successional planting and rotation and soil pH. And I know some plants require some pH and other plants and vice versa. So I was curious if you guys had some thoughts on that or anything that we should look out when regards to that, and why it might be beneficial to do more than one soil test for the whole garden, because different
Good
things
question.
might need different things, so to speak.
Good question, Cassandra. So in the scheme of things, a vegetable garden, we have, Lee mentioned 7 up to 8. Vegetables, you'll see a lot of references that'll say vegetables love 6.5. Well, I would love to have 6.5 in my area, but I have 7 to 7.4. I don't have any trouble growing vegetables. The closer you get to that exact 6.5, the more productive they are going to be. That is in the, the technological realm of things, the fundamentals of growth. But in my area, 7.4, I can still grow vegetables, and I just knocked everything over here. I can still be very successful. So as a backyard gardener, I'm very happy with what I grow. However, if I were a farmer, and Lee, what does corn grow best at? Do you know what the pH off the top of your head?
6.5 to 6.7.
6.5 to 6.7. If I'm a farmer, I'm going to want to try to hit that as close as possible, because the closer I get to that perfect environmental and soil condition for corn to grow, the more crop production. So for a farmer, in the big scheme of things, this farmer is going to be more precise. The backyard gardener, I can grow between 6.5 and 7.5 and still be successful. However, if I'm growing something like blueberries or any of the ericaceous plants that some of you guys up there, I know you guys can grow azaleas and rhododendrons where I can't. I'm going to want to make sure that if I have a blueberry plot, my blueberries need to stay at 6.5 for maximum growth. Plus, they're perennial plants. So I want to make sure that I keep that, or I have that pH. But again, like Lee mentioned, you only know this if you do a soil test, and you're only going to know that. So Cassandra, in the big picture of vegetable garden, I'm going to probably put in a wide variety of vegetables that will tolerate that pH from 6.5 to 7.5 and still grow. Do I want them to grow perfect? Then yes, I would worry about that. Now, in my vegetable garden, I'm going to do my soil test for that. But if I'm going to grow blueberries over here, then I will do a separate soil test for just those blueberries. so that I know what is perfect for those blueberries. Same thing if I'm growing trees or shrubs or lawn. I will grow, I will do all these different soil tests for those areas. But the reality of it is a backyard gardener tends to do a soil test when there's a problem. They don't think about it up front. So I'm glad you're doing that, Lee, that class on soils. I mean, that is the most important class for you guys. I appreciate you coming tonight, but that soil class is the most important because that's going to give you kind of the fundamentals on good plant growth. So it's a good one with a hard answer, Cassandra, but it just depends on what your outputs, what you want. If you want maximum output, then you're going to make sure every single crop you put in there, you meet that particular soil need. That's a really good question.
Thank you for answering it.
Linda had a question. Would it be okay to put wood ash in a compost pile?
Not any better in a compost pile if you're going to use that compost, just like Lee said. There's an old saying, the solution to pollution is dilution. So if I take my wood ash out of my fireplace, I've got a bucket and I have 20 acres and I spread that out over 20 acres. Well, that's not going to change the pH a lot. But if I'm a backyard gardener and I have a small garden and I put all my wood ash on there and I do it more than once, that's going to change the pH significantly. Same thing in that compost pile. If you have a really large compost pile and you mix a little bit in here and there, okay. But when you start putting it in on a regular basis, all of a sudden you change that pH. So if you're going to put it in a compost pile and then use that compost, no. And I know this is a problem. I understand this is a problem. We have fireplaces. Fortunately, I have 5 acres, so we can go out and spread it very wide over a large 5-acre area and never really make a dent in it. But if I had half acre and started doing that, eventually I'm going to make a change in that soil pH.
And I'll add to that. It really depends on the size of your garden that you're going to be applying to, and how many ashes you're taking out. So if you're taking out 10 or 15 gallons of wood ash a season or more, and you're putting it in a small 100 square foot garden, or if you're using it in raised beds for a certain crop, you may be raising that pH too extreme. But if you are gardening on an acre and you take out 1 or 2 buckets of wood ash a year and you spread that around, probably not going to cause too much harm. But it all comes down to how much are you taking out and what space are you putting it into. A question, the woman who lived at the house before me said she put ash from the pellet burner in the raised beds, says it was almost no veggies last year.
I would definitely get that soil tested in that raised bed. That's, wow. It'd be interesting, Lee, to see what the results of that was.
Yeah,
Madison,
so
definitely get a soil test.
some crops, if you have your fertility out of whack, tomatoes are a big one. If you over fertilize a crop, they're going to say, why do I need to put out fruit when all of this nutrient is here? I'm going to be as big and green and beautiful as possible. I don't need to put out any sort of fruit. So fertility is very important for not only healthy plants, but maximum production as well.
What's really cool, you're going to learn about this in your soil class, but fertility, your soil might have a lot of fertility. You might have a lot of potassium and potash in the soil, but if that pH is too high or too low, those nutrients aren't available to that plant. So when you get a pH of 8 or a pH of 3, you may have the nutrients in the soil, but they're just not in a form that the plant can take in. So you are going to learn, it's just really cool. Soil chemistry, I'm not really good at it, but it's very cool. You're going to learn a lot about why pH affects how you fertilize, how what you add to the plant, what you add to the garden. So yeah, definitely get a soil test on that one.
I did put a link in the chat box if you are interested in purchasing the soil test kits online. That'll take you to a form you can fill out, pay with a credit card, and we can get those in the mail to you. Are there any other questions? I know we're coming to the end of our time here. All right.
Lee, Cassandra, you guys have a great group here. This is going to be a fun session.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
All right. If there are no last questions, thank you, Pam. And I will turn it back over to Cassandra.
So I just have a couple housekeeping things before we wrap up tonight. If you use the email that you would like me to send the reminder of our Tuesday night meeting, our Tuesday night workshop, that's fine. I have it. I have whatever you put into Eventbrite. We're good to go. If there's a different email address you would like me to use to send you the reminders every week during the course, I just put my email address in the chat box and you can send that to me. Or you can send me a message privately in the chat right now. That's the only real big housekeeping piece. We will be sharing all of the recordings of these workshops at the end of the series. We'll be sharing some PDF resources that we're all working to compile. We'll have the presentation slides. All of these things will be shared to everybody. We're hoping to get them together on a USB flash drive to send out to folks afterwards, but we'll keep you updated on exactly how we'll be able to get those materials out to you guys. But they will come. And we are recording all of the sessions throughout the course of the workshop series too. So does anybody have any questions about housekeeping kind of things? Any questions about how we'll move forward? It's the same Zoom link. We'll be using the same exact information. There was a little thing to add it to your calendar too, but yeah, I see people dropping off because it doesn't seem like they have any other questions. But some workshops might go a little bit longer, but we'll wrap up between about 8 and 8:30 each week. And yeah, that's all I have. So thank you all so much for coming. I'd like to thank our speaker, Pamela, for joining us today. Thank my co-host, Lee. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And I can't wait to see you guys next week.
Yes, and just a reminder, next week is season extension with Jacqueline Kowalski. So we're going to be learning about how you can extend those cold season and warm season crops even further. So, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Cassandra.
Thank you, Pam. All right. Well, is there anything you need from me tonight, Cassandra?
No, I think we're good. I was just pulling the transcript real quick. I have a copy of that saved too.
Awesome.
So.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, I think it went well. We had 29 people on is what I saw as the high. So
Yeah, that was the high too. So that's what I was kind of figuring with that. I was hoping about a quarter of folks that signed up. So we'll see if we can keep like 20 to 30 people each week. That'll be really exciting.
yeah, excellent. All right. Well, thank you and have a good night.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Bye.